Hello once again, and welcome to Profiles. I'm Ed Hyland, and today is devoted to exceptional children and education. Joining me is Dr. Rebecca Hines. Dr. Hines received her PhD from the University of South Florida, and for nearly 6 years now has been with the University of Central Florida at the Department of Child, Family, and Community Services. Dr. Hines, thank you so much for coming by.
Thank you.
First, give us an idea. What got you interested and excited about special education?
Interested and excited. I'm not sure those would have been my early choices of words for my field.
Well, you are now, so take us back.
I am. Well, I'll tell you, Ed, I was one of those people who grew up always knowing they wanted to work with kids, and I suppose I never considered working with exceptional kids in particular. And I was early on in my college career working as a assistant at a regular school with regular kids, and I enjoyed it. One of my good friends worked at a school across town with kids with exceptionalities, and she said, "Becky, come and be an assistant at our school." I was like, "Why?" She said, "Oh, it's fun. We do this. You can teach swimming. We can do this." And so I thought, okay, I'll go take a look. So, I was 20 years old. You're willing to switch mid-year. So I go take a look at her school, and I walked in, and I don't think I was emotionally prepared really for what I was walking into. And when I walked into her school, it was a center for kids with severe and profound disabilities. And I walked in and I looked around, and I was, frankly, I had the same reaction that almost everybody does in that situation. I felt sorry for these kids. I felt very nervous. All I could see was really stereotypical things. I saw some drooling and just things that everybody conjures in their mind when they think of kids with these severe disabilities. And I was like, I walked through that school that day and I thought, oh my gosh, I can't work here. That's what I really thought. And that night I was talking to my friend again. She said, "What'd you think? Would you come and work here?" And I said, "Yeah, you know what? I don't think I can." And she said, "Oh, we really need somebody." And I said, "Okay, I'll tell you what. Let me think about it, and I'm going to come back tomorrow, and I'll give you my answer." So the next day, I sat there that night, and what I realized was, everybody thinks that it's, oh, you must be a special person to work with those kids. That's what people say to special educators. And what I realized that night was, it's not a special person who works with those kids. It's somebody who can sit back and say, gosh, let me just change the way I think about this. Let me change the way I'm looking at this. So I went in the next day and I walked in, and instead of seeing all the differences, all the things that seemed foreign and scary to me, I walked in, I looked at these kids, and all I saw were the smiles and the excitement and this group of people who were so happy to see me. And I thought, gosh, I was just looking at this the wrong way. And I was so struck by my own preconceived notions and my own initial fear, and in kind of reflecting on that, I realized if not me, then who they can't find people to work here. So I'm thankful still that I had the ability to kind of change my way of thinking about people and looking at similarities and things that I have come to love about all people. And to see that in even people who seem so different.
Were you embarrassed by that initial reaction after you had a chance to go back and get to know the kids a little bit better? Were you embarrassed about the way you initially felt, or
I don't know if it's embarrassment, because to be honest, I have colleagues who hate me for saying, but to be honest, when we're talking about people with really noticeable severe differences, it's human nature. And I was young. I was 20. I hadn't grown up with people like that. Mm-hmm. I didn't have people like that around me. So it was the initial assessment of who are these people? How could I possibly help them, because they're so different from me? And I use that. I tell my students that now because I want them to understand that it's not a special person who works with these kids. It's a person who can see people for exactly who they are and appreciate everyone.
So it's not a matter of finding out how people are different, as your initial reaction might be, but how much you were alike.
Right. And when you really, I later worked with, I've worked as a special education teacher, and I've also worked as a language arts teacher with kids, just your average run-of-the-mill general education classrooms. And I loved it. I loved being a language arts teacher. I had so much fun. It was fantastic. But what I learned was from doing that, I learned that this is fun, this is great, but these kids learn in spite of me. They can do things in spite, with or without me. They didn't need me. And frankly, I guess I enjoyed feeling like I could problem solve and look at every person individually and bring out the best in everyone, even the people who some other people might not have thought, might not be able to see what potential they had. So
you said you're about 20 or so when this
Yeah,
revelation,
that
if you will, happened. And in the course of my career, I've had a chance to go and see some of the changes that have occurred in the school system in particular. And I wanted to see if I could get your reaction, just some of the changes you have seen over the years. And I guess one of the big issues these days, and it continues to be an issue, is the issue of mainstreaming. At one time, it was you put those kids were put in a special school, and they were only kept in the special school because for some reason they weren't supposed to mix with the normal kids.
Right.
And so that has become something that is entirely outdated and old-fashioned, I think, in my mind now. So give us an idea what you saw over the years.
Well, we have gradually in the school systems become more inclusive. And in inclusion, it's a term that in education gets thrown around and kind of leaves people, at least in the last decade, people were unsure of what inclusion meant. And I think a lot of parents and families are quite unsure of what that means as well. But inclusion is a concept, and it's the idea that all people deserve to have the same access to the same things. And in the schools, in the 80s, there was a real regular education initiative that really looked at kind of merging general and special education more formally. And that push has continued to grow. Mainstreaming was before this, but this was a more formal look at combining the two. And it's been a kind of a slow process. Most recently, there have been a lot of new amendments and a lot of changes that have really put everybody together and held kids with exceptionalities to accountability levels that they weren't previously held to. So there are a lot of changes. And the school that I mentioned, and the school which I had my first experience, that was a specific center for kids with special needs. And I'll tell you, I am a huge proponent of inclusion. I really believe that everybody should have the same opportunities. And I believe that we should help people find ways to be a part of society. Honestly, the school which I worked, it was a great facility. And the kids were happy there. And there's a lot of people who say, oh, for my child with severe disabilities, man, that's a great place because you have a isolated group of people who can help my child and have better understanding and a different understanding. And I think that's kind of the conventional wisdom. The truth is, when we do that, my fear is that we don't allow the rest of society the opportunity to get to know that there are so many different types of people out there, and they don't really learn how to interact with and get along with and appreciate people with all different kinds of...
Perhaps overcome some of the stereotypes and prejudices.
It's really difficult to do that if we're always segregating everyone. And so there are currently many more kids with exceptionalities who are included in the general schools, and probably increasingly so.
Is it helping at all that the technology has increased and gotten so much better in that we're able to get some web-based instruction to kids and actually, I believe one of the things you have been working on and doing is video conferencing or classrooms, if you will, working with kids. I mean, is this type of thing really helping?
Well, I guess you must be a visionary because it's not exactly happening in the public schools yet. Ideally, I would love to see that happen more, specifically in providing content to kids, whether they are homebound because they might have some specific reason that they can't get into a school for a period of time or medical reasons. Whether it's a rural area where kids don't have access to the same kind of rich content teachers, especially at the secondary level. I think that there's going to be increasingly a call for providing content-rich material to kids using the web. And certainly that's on the rise, but not necessarily specific to special education. I have been working at UCF to help provide more online training for people who are becoming exceptional education teachers. And our goal, as everyone around the country is struggling to create highly qualified teachers to work with our kids. So the web is giving us more of an outreach, but there are certain, teaching is so interactive that there's a certain backlash when you try to present all of your courses on the web. Then people don't learn the very human side of working with kids. I primarily, on our campus, I'm working in Daytona now, I work with students on all of our campuses, but I really try to create a lot of field experiences so that our university students have a chance to get in there and work with people with differences. So they have some hands-on experience. They might do some of their coursework online, but they have some very human experiences as well.
I guess where I was going is and maybe this is more isolated than I realized, but for kids with various limitations, physical limitations, they are sometimes including them via a camera or something via the web, where a classroom will sit of the so-called normal kids, and then this child can be included with the group, even though physical barriers or physical barriers prevent them from actually joining into the class itself. So I guess that's where I was going with some of that.
I think, again, that's an interesting idea. That's not actually, what is happening is kids are being physically included. And people who are proponents of inclusion believe that no matter how severe an exceptionality, that child has a right to be in the classroom with his non-disabled peers. So even if it takes having a nurse in there because the child's on, feeding tube, breathing apparatus, there are inclusion proponents who would say that child has a right to be there, and that the support goes into the general classroom instead of having people in a segregated setting, even via the web. I suspect my thinking web-wise is that's going to be more of an outreach with the content, as much as it has been in rural schools where they don't have maybe a Spanish teacher on their campus, so they'll broadcast somebody from a bigger high school into their school.
Sure.
So I could see that might have some real potential.
Now you've worked also, as I believe, with problem kids as well, kids with various issues. Maybe you want to get into that a little bit as well.
Well, I have. My specific area of interest is trying to help kids who have been labeled emotionally handicapped, behaviorally disordered, trying to help not the kids necessarily, but also the teachers to understand that for every behavior, for every single behavior, there is a cause. And when we just try to look at things one-dimensionally and we just keep punishing the same kids over and over and over, if it didn't work the first time, it's really unlikely that punishment, you can yell at a kid 15 times a day. If it didn't work the first time, then you're really just wasting your breath. And in children, especially small children, their behavior is a manifestation of something else. And so we could try to help people understand that when you have a child cuss you out, and he's in kindergarten, which I had kids cuss me out who are in kindergarten, that's really abnormal. The kind of anger and frustration behind this, lashing out, that's abnormal for a kindergartner. But to just punish that child for cursing me is not at all solving the problem, because there's some need, there's something going on with this child that's causing that behavior. It's just coming out in this language, but there's a bigger problem, And so there are a lot of different ways at looking at behavior, and a lot of people who look at that more of a behavioral approach. But in working with these kids, I'm always looking for ways to help people find a different view of behavior so they can begin to construct some different ways of dealing with it.
What are your views on the use of medications as a tool in this area?
The use of medications as a tool.
I thought I was being nice about that.
That's fantastic. Well, the model for thinking about behavior that I just described would be considered a psychodynamic model, kind of a behavior as a system of unmet needs. That's one conceptual model. The behavioral model, where there's the punishment and reward, that's kind of the traditional model. And the one that you've described is the biophysical or the biomedical model, which has become increasingly popular, as you well know, as we learn more about the brain and different physiology that drives behavior. So my own opinion about that particular model is I'm all for anything that's science-based, and I am very interested in brain research. I personally feel like we look too quickly to that model.
It's easy.
Because it's the easy way. And I also, again, back to the old if it's not working problem. If you're using that model but you're not seeing dramatic changes in the behavior, is that really a successful intervention for that child? And a lot of times using a biophysical approach really should be in conjunction with another model for behavior change so that you could gradually fade that.
How do you do that? How do you go about the child? Okay, you've got the kindergarten child, he's yelling, cursing at you. How do you begin the CSI, if you will, the investigation into finding out the root cause? Why is this child acting in this fashion?
Well, there's the procedure that I would say is the most common. You look at the ABCs of behavior, the antecedent, the behavior, and the consequence. And this is all part of designing a positive behavioral support for that child. And you first look and you say, what happens right before this behavior? So you might look at some of the surface things first. What happens right before this behavior? So right before this child cusses me out, I notice he has been ignored. Nobody's interacting with him. So maybe if I can notice that and see what's going on before the behavior, then that's one step to solving. Now I see the behavior is cursing me out. Now what's the consequence of his behavior? He curses me out and now I punish him. Well, is he being reinforced by my punishment? Is he getting my attention? Is that what he wants? So you see, you start to kind of use the ABCs, look at the antecedent, the behavior, and the consequence. But I'll give you kind of a real life scenario. I had a student in middle school who was, he came up to me, he was a general education student, and there were kids with behavior problems included in his classroom. And this boy came up to me and he said, I don't want to get anybody in trouble, but Lisa is, every day when I come in, she hits me. I said, okay, fair enough. Well, Lisa was a girl in 8th grade who weighed probably 280 pounds, could barely fit in a desk. And the boy who was telling me this was, 5'9", and a big, strong, athletic boy. And I looked at him and I said, okay, Mike, I see that's a problem. The problem is Lisa's hitting you. And he said, yes, ma'am, she does it every day when I walk by her desk. So I said, Mike, I got to ask you, man, are you a fast runner? And he said, yeah, I really am one of the fastest ones in the class. I said, well, that's great news because I've got a perfect solution for you. Tomorrow when you come into class, instead of walking down her row, why don't you walk the other direction and go around the back and sneak up the back? Because if she gets up and chases you, I bet you can run away. And he's like, oh, okay. Like he had never thought of that. But you see, that by giving him the solution, the next day I said, Mike, how did that work out? He said, oh, great, she didn't hit me. Fantastic. I said, tomorrow, try something for me. When you come in, I want you to say hello to her. Just walk by, say, hi, Lisa, and then walk around the back. So he tried that for a few days because he's a very nice boy. End of the week, Mike comes up and he says, you know what, that's really worked. He said, yesterday, Lisa said hello to me in the hall. And I said, Mike, that's great. I said, because I feel like maybe Lisa doesn't have a lot of friends. Maybe that was why she was hitting you. And he's like, oh, yeah, right. He said, now I bet I can walk down her row. I said, I bet you can. And he did. So the antecedent for her aggression was not having any attention from peers. And by helping this student in her class realize, there are reasons that cause this behavior, Mike, be a part of the solution. Because the consequence, he hit her, she got a reaction from him. But teaching him that simple formula empowered him to help shape her behavior. But there's always something behind it. And I'm not sure we do a good enough job teaching everybody that there's a reason behind these kinds of behaviors.
Someone that doesn't have your insight and knowledge, that same scenario, though, is kind of faced with a dilemma. Is Mike just perhaps doing this walk by on purpose so she will strike him because he wants that attention from her?
Right. Or
is she the problem and is striking out again because she needs attention?
Well, and that's true. And it was an interesting choice by Mike to come and tell me, what do you you're a big boy. Get out of the way. It's I wondered why Mike was telling me that. But because I did work with both students, I knew her to be physically aggressive. She hit everybody. She hit everybody who walked by her in the hall. She hit everybody who walked by her desk. She hit everyone. And nobody stopped to think why. So by pointing out to Mike, does she have a lot of friends? If she doesn't, do you see why and helping other people be a part of the solution. What would typically happen is the student tells the teacher, and then Lisa gets in trouble for hitting. Right. But you see, she had been through 8 years of school with that model, and that wasn't working. So sometimes it takes looking at a situation differently.
Yeah, it also gives you that insight then to perhaps work on something that will give her less incentive to start
less incentive, exactly.
How do you work it when the situation, let's combine the two elements that we've been talking about here. We have someone who has difficulties from an emotional standpoint, problem children, just as a general category. But perhaps maybe also is a special needs child, has some physical or other issue that prevents them from being, as we would say, a so-called normal child. Is it different when the two become combined? Are they treated in a different fashion than you would treat either one separately?
Well, it's an interesting question. No. No, next. By definition, a child who's labeled emotionally handicapped, or that's what we call a child with those needs in Florida. Some states call it kids with behavior disorders or emotional disturbance, and we're kind of going to a emotional disturbance as label. But EH, so our kids who have these emotional issues, the characteristics, the very first one is an inability to learn that cannot be explained by intellectual reasons. So a child's behavior, for example, I'm going to use a child with mental disabilities as an example. If a child who has some mental disabilities exhibits a particular behavior, it may or may not be a sign of disturbance. It may be that child doesn't understand that his behavior is not appropriate. And so it's often that label does not coexist with other labels because they're usually other factors. And learning disabilities is actually the biggest label of kids who fit under exceptional education services. And that population is actually probably the most misunderstood. Kids who have the label of learning disabilities, by definition, are not mentally handicapped. Okay, so a child who is learning disabled has an IQ that is average, the cutoff score is 70 in Florida, or above. And everybody has this idea that those children are mentally disabled. Not everybody has that idea, but many people have that idea. That's not at all true. So you could have a child with a learning disability who also has emotional behavioral disorders. The trick is to figure out, are his behavior problems caused because he's trying to mask this learning problem? So you see, it's and in the case of kids with other types of exceptionalities that we serve in the school, there are not. We serve kids with learning disabilities, emotional behavioral disorders, and mild handicaps in classrooms for varying exceptionalities often. So they're all grouped together anyway in some districts. So they're kind of all receiving similar services with specific goals for themselves. And most of them include behavior goals, whether or not they have the label emotionally handicapped, if that's a need.
I see. Are we ever going to get to the point where we're talking about inclusion and at the same time we're talking about kids with special needs? Are we ever going to get to the point where the labels won't be there? I mean, is that too hopeful, I guess?
I'm just glad you asked that. Actually, I'm glad you're even aware enough to ask that. People in my field, everybody in my field would give you a different response to that, because some people, a lot of people in exceptional education would say, well, we need the labels because that's what drives the services, and that's true. I often pose the question to my students, shouldn't every single child at any given school who feels like they need extra help have a resource room to go to? Why do you have to have a label to get extra help if that's what you need? Why do we have some arbitrary cutoff range for mental handicap of IQ of 70 or below? What about the kid with an IQ of 71? Doesn't he deserve access to those resources if he wants or needs them? So there, as far as looking at the labels, there are such a wide such a wide spectrum of views on that. The current movement to include more kids in the general education classroom with support from trained exceptional educators, that's the key. That has been the key. We're really moving toward placing as many kids in the general setting as we can, but with support for those general education teachers. It's different from mainstreaming. We're not suggesting all kids just need to be pushed in there without support. But I feel like, and from my experience, because I had the opportunity to work as a co-teacher where there was a general ed teacher and myself both teaching in one classroom, you could not pick out my kids with emotional behavioral disorders in that classroom. You could not pick out my kids. Now, if you pulled them all out and put them together, you could tell they had some emotional issues. But when you put them all in with support from me, it was kind of behind the scenes, and I'm just interacting with this teacher as a co-teacher, just both of us teaching everyone, yeah, the labels really did disappear. Now, will that formally happen? No, but can it happen conceptually? Absolutely.
And on that note, I think it'd be a fine time to say thank you so much for joining us today,
All right.
Becky Hines. Appreciate it so much. Continue the work, and we'll get you back sometime.
All
We'll
right.
kind of see how things are going, and got to talk to you about that web stuff too, I think. And thank you so much for joining us once again on Profiles. I'm Ed Highland. We'll see you next time.